Welcome to the WAN Manager Podcast. I'm your host, Bryan, and this is the show where we talk to networking experts about the data services that make business possible. So certainly anyone who's listened to the show quite a bit, network automation as a broad concept comes up very often and is likely on the minds of most folks that are tuning in. Something we really haven't talked about, I think, explicitly on the show is the sort of HR aspect of upskilling workers to accommodate these changes, maybe even acquiring new talent as you make these transformations and make it work with the services that are out there. Perhaps transforming network engineers into software developers is not necessarily what everyone is super excited to do. So to help us think through all of that, since I know very little about this topic, I'm very happy to welcome to the show Michael Martin, who is the Senior Expert of Networking and Network Security at McKinsey Co. Welcome, Michael.
Hi there.
All right, so Michael, I think we first met when you were on the Enterprise Advisory Council at the group formerly known as Metro Ethernet Forum, and then after that, you've become a frequent speaker at the New York WAN Summit, or maybe virtual iterations. I think you got to actually go to one of them. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but yeah. So I've heard your background a little bit and whatnot in that. I think most of the listeners are probably well familiar with McKinsey and Company. But could you take us through, a little bit of how you got to where you are and what exactly you're doing over at McKinsey?
Right. So I've been with the firm almost for 2 decades, and largely I focused a good part of that time dealing with issues with the firm itself, like how we deal with our own connectivity, how we support our consultants, and both in the offices and remotely. In the last, I would probably say last 5 or 6 years, as we've been basically embracing a larger and larger approach to technology as well, like everyone else, I've been basically also helping client teams and working with some of our clients occasionally on trying to figure out some of these challenges around how to basically become a digital entity, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a really great background, because you're coming from sort of doing your internal clients have mostly been, sort of employees at McKinsey, doing the job that a lot of our listeners are WAN managers for non sort of like telecom oriented Fortune 1000 kind of companies. But now you have that perspective of working with some of those other enterprises and sort of helping them figure this out based on what you figured out. Is that fair to say, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And of course, before I joined the firm, I had also worked at ISPs. I worked at America Online at some point, and for a number of startups. So I was lucky enough when I came to the firm to have a sort of an industry-based perspective, which I was able to help sort of transform how the firm addressed these things. So I've been very fortunate in my time at the firm, and it's really been an amazing experience, and it's an amazing place to work, as you could probably imagine. So
yeah, well, if it kept you for 2 decades, right? So
yeah, exactly. The topic for me for my whole career largely has been around how to basically bring network engineers into a sort of a professional development track. Because when it was funny, when I started, I was originally a systems person, and then I basically gravitated to networking just because it was just more interesting, and I liked the software and the hardware aspects of it. So, but what I found out was, as I was basically moving on, that what you would find is that you'd have people who were systems oriented, and then you'd have people who were networkers who came traditionally from a telecom background, and they don't necessarily, have the same skill sets or even the same approach to how they vision solutions. So, this topic of network automation, has, as it's basically been emerging over the last, decade, has really become very interesting, because whereas traditionally network automation and orchestration was something that was really done at very, very large scale in
On the
telecommunications
carrier level,
industries,
right? Yeah, yeah.
at the carrier level, in the ISP space, et cetera. It really wasn't something that really took hold until really the turn of the century,
Mm-hmm.
when you know enterprise networking really started to come into its own, and now, well, you really couldn't operate without a wide area network anymore, and I think
Right.
that's been the big shift. The challenge I find, what's so interesting is that a lot of the current practitioners, they missed that whole decade of
Mm.
the
Mm-hmm.
pain that we all had
Interesting.
to go
Yeah.
through to get
Yeah.
to this point. And because they sort of came to um, a technology space that um, has matured very rapidly to basically facilitate amazing levels of connectivity. The those That first decade, right, that in the 1990s, really formed a lot of what happens today.
Mm.
And it's helpful to to be able to have that mindset of understanding the approaches that we take to when we want to look at problems like network automation, and now what is known as network orchestration.
Right. That's a really interesting way to frame it. I always kind of joke I should make a little jingle for the show, because I think I start out most of our shows with like asking my guests to clearly define exactly what it is we're talking about, because in the telecom and IT space, everyone can use terms in a very subjective way, right? So I like that framing of thinking of it from like the 90s, of like, sort of a network was maybe private lines between an office and another office, or a hub and spoke, or something like that. When a lot of folks hear the term network automation, the first thing that comes to mind, depending maybe on what side they're on, is SDN, or on the end user side, SD-WAN. But you're talking about a network automation that has much deeper roots in things like like frame relay and MPLS, or what is it that you're sort of envisioning here?
Well, again, it's more about thinking of it in this terms.
Hmm.
So networking automation, right, is essentially a task-oriented function, right?
Hmm.
If it goes back to what automation is, right? You
Right.
know, the thing about automation is that we automate because we're trying to basically eliminate errors. We're trying to make
Right.
a better product. We're trying to deliver faster. We're trying to enable, right, um, something. But there's a massive investment that goes into automation, right? If you look
Right.
at where automation is predominant, right, in manufacturing, um, you know, you couldn't do what we do today as a society without having automation. But there's a
Gotcha.
large investment into it. So the challenge comes in is that first you have to be able to think about things in an automated way. If you
Hmm.
think of network automation as task automation, right? I want to
Anything that
do
can be
something.
repeated easily shouldn't be done by a
Exactly.
human, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's this repetitive function, right? Now, whereas when we get into software-defined networking and say the cloud and even large-scale enterprise management, now we're trying to basically embrace orchestration, right? Which is
Hmm.
this, which is now this event-driven shift, right? So
Mm.
before, when I was starting to automate, I was doing tasks. Now I want to start to orchestrate. Now I'm trying to basically take a collection of tasks or build an assembly line or a pipeline or however you want to frame it, to basically go and have this thing be resulting as like a product, right? So I like to think of the terms as, you know, automation is largely about the configuration of a device, right?
Mhm.
Which
Mm. Mhm.
ideally in a network you have to do in these very specific steps, where orchestration is about the provisioning of a environment or an event. So, you can think of it as, especially with networking, on one hand, I have to provision an environment, which
Mhm.
might be the racking and stacking of hardware, or I need to basically deploy a lot of virtualized network appliances or a networking software-defined networking environment on top of hardware, right? That's more along the lines of orchestration, right, or provisioning. And then I still have to deal with all the configuration management. And
Right.
then what happens is I need to manage this, right? Because networking is not something you can just automate. right? I can't just magically come up with a set of firewall rules if I don't understand how you need to build a security policy.
Right.
I can't just randomly just generate an L2 network or an L3 network that needs to have network identifiers, VLAN IDs, IP addresses. So now, in order to basically go down this journey, I have to have a lot of sources of truth, right? Or these large inventory systems to
Mm-hmm.
basically manage all this for me, right? So
Mm-hmm.
now we've gotten from first I wanted to write a script where I wanted to basically configure a network device to now, hi, I want to basically manage this very complex ecosystem with all these different components, with all of these different data set variables, and then I have to coordinate all of this, right? This is a very daunting thing
Yeah.
for anybody to think about. And if you're a, a WAN manager or a network manager or a firewall platform manager, or if you're responsible for basically facilitating that, you're sitting there trying, well, how am I going to manage this? Now, the way it's been historically dealt with has been vendors provide, management GUIs and environments.
Right.
But,
Right.
you know, if you're basically working in a scenario where I have 3 or 4 or 5 vendors, right? Each one of those products is doing different things. I
Mm.
now have to basically
Mm-hmm.
support interfacing with cloud providers as well.
Right.
I keep adding onto the list of interfaces that I have to manage. So now I get into this challenge of I need the manager of managers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I need to buy a third party broker administrative product, right? And that's a whole new trend that's coming. So
Great.
where do you start,
Mm-hmm.
right? How do I what does that path look like for an enterprise? Like I can keep buying products and then have them deal with one-offs, and that works if you're staffed in such a way where you've got people who are doing one specific function, right? Which is largely how a lot of large enterprises
Right.
try to organize themselves, right? I've got people with a specific skill set, they deliver a specific function, right? But that doesn't necessarily work for people who are smaller enterprises
Mm-hmm.
or for universities or
Yeah.
any place that has a
Or
networking
even,
problem.
some enterprises have a pretty tight networking team, even if they're pretty large. So I run across the gamut from folks who have almost like a mini telco internally, and folks who have a very small team that now, just like you say, especially if they're coming out of an environment where most of this work was passed on to a small number of vendors, and now it's kind of pulled back onto them because there's a lot more vendors, like you suggested, that you have to deal with, both in the networking space, in the cloud space, and the security space. A lot of that used to be, if my data centers were all on campus and I had an MPLS network and I had centralized breakouts with a firewall there, there's a lot of simplicity. If I have a team that was made to manage that, I imagine in the world we find ourselves in 2022, it's a very difficult situation.
That's exactly the problem because you built your environment and your ecosystem around your staffing,
Mm-hmm.
and again you made choices to basically manage that. So it's very common that you'll talk to to a mid-sized enterprise. Oh yeah, well we have our firewalls are in our data center and we bring traffic back and whatever. And the fact is that if when all your applications were in your data center, that made perfect sense.
Right.
But
Right.
if your applications are now in the cloud and they're all distributed, right? Well, that's not necessarily the best experience. So now we have to bring in this brand new type style of networking, which of course, has led to this massive adoption, right, of SD-WAN and whether you're managing it yourself or as a managed service, because your traditional environment, right, which was built around your data center, just isn't really compatible with a quality user experience.
Right.
So that's the shift, and the shift was brought by you moving your applications outside of your control and into other environments. But even in those cases, right, most enterprises, once they make a serious investment in cloud, tend to basically go down the path where they're basically establishing, direct connect relationships, where they have, the ability to have dedicated bandwidth and prioritization. So, really, what's really been amazing with this new public cloud approach is that now you're sort of seeing the shift away from like, well, it used to be I had to build it myself, or I then outsourced it and then someone else built it for me. And now we're in this hybrid world where I can have some of it, where I build it, some of it where somebody else is building it, and some of it which is in the cloud. And, we're really, just to step off the top for a second, we're really just beginning to realize the true value of, for enterprises at least, to have distributed, broadly delivered applications, because
of
even
course.
that
Yeah.
in itself, right? And I remember, you know, 5 years ago having conversations with people. I'm like, well, how can I compete against a Facebook application or
Right.
any sort of cloud consumer application at the enterprise level? Because it's a completely different set of scaling and services, right?
Right.
But all of that is all driven by automation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this big
Mm-hmm.
shift
Mm-hmm.
moving from, you know, and I mean, anyone who's used Amazon or whatever, they know what an elastic load balancer is, right? Well, I just
Right.
I increase more capacity, right? Or anyone who's running web services, well, in the holiday season or, during the draft or whatever, I have these massive, expansion requirements where I have to, increase my capacity, and then I have to reduce it. So all of that is the kind of stuff that gets driven through automation at an
Right.
application layer, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the network level, you're having to basically deal with those same exact challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so now how do you get there, right? That's really the other challenge. How do I get there? And there's a couple different ways that people will do this. Like some people basically look at it as I start small, right? I begin to basically look at being able to construct and utilize basic network automation, which is what most network engineers do.
Right. Right.
A lot of people just write scripts and do that. And the great thing is that, with these rise of these much better tools that didn't exist, 20 years ago or 30 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
now there are very large communities that are contributing, amazing code and amazing sets of tools, right? So it makes it, there's a much easier way for network engineers to embrace
It's not
and
as
sort of take
bespoke
on
as it
this.
once had to be. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. But just learning those skills is not necessarily enough. In the
Mm-hmm.
end, right, your team or your leadership has to be sort of embrace that change, right? That now we need to basically move away from bespoke and start to build out these automatable, replicatable structures. And then
Mm-hmm.
this in turn requires this investment. Right
Right.
now, the CMDB used to be the record for servers, right? But now, um, now we looked at the CMDBs as reference sources of truth or reference points for everything, right? Whether it's an IP phone or a networking switch or a server or a cloud instance or whatever, because you need to be able to use some sort of context, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that you can create these events, right? So
Right.
that's the thing, is that we use terms like, oh, it's event driven or task driven, or or terms like impotent. And well, if I need my thing to be idempotent, well, what does that mean? It just means
Mm-hmm.
that if you run the command, it doesn't overwrite what's there, which means that
Right.
it checked it
Right.
first,
Right.
right? But that's critical, because I can't, if I run a script and it creates a whole new set of load balancers and it creates a whole new set of virtual IPs, well, that's going to be a real problem, because
Right.
I may just knock out a whole service. So it's being able to go through a process where you're actually able to structure and break down the problem, literally almost like by hand. Like I use the analogy of,
Mm.
how do you make a peanut butter sandwich, right? Can you write a set of instructions for somebody, for an
Right.
alien who didn't know?
Right.
Like,
Right.
well, how would you do that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's that kind of process. But that takes a little bit of discipline, and everyone wants to shortcut, because as a as humans, we are always able to adapt contextually. So we'll skip these things. Oh, I don't need this. Well, wait a second. If back to the peanut butter sandwich analogy, if you wanted to make a peanut butter sandwich, but you didn't have peanut butter, could you make the sandwich? Well,
Right.
now I need to get peanut butter, right? So
Yeah.
you can go as far back. You're like, well, I have to get a job, and then I have to have
Right.
a car, so I can drive to the store to get the
Mm,
peanut butter. So, and again, that's another challenge. It's being able to define that problem. How do I
hmm
basically frame the problem? What do I establish as the base context? Like these things need to be in place in order for me to be able to go forward and create
Right.
something. So you have to take a very systematic approach and frame, right, each of these automation tasks and then again these orchestration tasks in these frameworks that are defined so that you know, well, these are the data components or these are the resources that I need to basically make this work,
hmm
right? If it's something that's already been in place, there has to be a logic that checks it and verifies, yes, I want to make this change, or no, I don't want to make this change. And again, there's a lot of software platforms out there that do this, which is another path you can go. But
hmm
even with those tools, you still have to make this investment, right? Or this business process or engineering effort where you're starting to think about how you're going to manage these things.
Right.
And I think what I see, especially for people who are trying to get into network automation, is that they tend to be very easily able to focus around the task. That's easy, right?
It's pulling back.
For a
That's hard,
networker,
right? So yeah.
it's the pulling back. Whereas
Right.
a systems person or a software person, the idea of all of those component pieces, that orchestration, that's bread and butter for them because
hmm
that's what they've had to do their whole lives. Well, I need a server for the web thing to run on, so I got to have that, and then it goes back to context.
hmm
So you know, as a manager, right, what you're sort of trying to basically do is sort of set a set of expectations of what do you see the business value of that you're going to get from network automation and from network
Right.
orchestration, and then figure out, well, how do we want to basically take the approach to do this, because inevitably we're going to have to make some investments in our inventories. What kind of data do we need in those inventories? How do we manage things like VLAN identifiers or anything, right? It goes back to your ability to basically accelerate this journey is just as dependent upon what you were doing in the past. If you have a very good
Mm-hmm.
operational environment where you have effectively documented things and you have a clear vision for how things are operationally, it's a much easier journey. If you have a very large environment that you keep running because you have effective monitoring and it's been engineered well, but you don't necessarily have, right, the granular picture of things, you'll find your network automation journey is much harder
hmm
because now you're sort of having to go back and sort of re-envision your environment because you need to have these data points so that you can create these event driven, right, or task oriented, deliverables.
Right. Well, and I assume in this kind of scenario, you're also dealing with the fact that if I'm, sort of tasked with the management of this, with getting each of those individual sort of IT infrastructure team members to work on these, writing out these new scripts and finding these new event-driven things to automate. We're still in an environment where we have to keep a continuity going with whatever we had in place already, and however we're adding that on top, right? So that's got to be a big challenge as well. That this has to happen on top of, probably a lot of teams already, thinner than they would like to be, keeping all the lights on everywhere, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is a very large challenge, and especially, right, in especially in the context of the times we're in right now, because most businesses are in some phase of a transformative journey, right?
hmm
Of
hmm
trying to basically how to embrace this new digital world we live in. So where you have the challenges are is, from a resourcing perspective, is on one hand, you're being driven to basically, deliver more with less, right?
Right.
You see automation as a pathway to basically enable that, right? But you may or may not be able to really be able to realize that because you
Still have a
don't
job.
necessarily have
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
you still have a
yeah.
job, and the fact is that because of the way your job is, you don't have the foundation to basically drive that journey. So that's why it's so key as a manager, right? As a networking manager, to be very clear about what the business value,
Right,
investment, and
right.
return is, right?
Hmm.
Because whereas the tendency is, well, we're trying to shift away from technology driven problem solving to right to business solving. We're trying to
Right,
build a environment where we're coupling technology with the business to accomplish desired outcomes. So the challenge, right, is explaining. So yes, we're completely on board with that, but we need to basically make an investment on our side. And I
right.
think sometimes that gets lost because there isn't necessarily always a clear understanding of the complexity or the challenges of technology, right, from the business side. So part of that is, as a manager, you have to basically be that person that's translating that, right?
Hmm.
Who's basically saying, so this is why this is this way, not in, some, we're having a memory buffer overrun and something that somebody doesn't understand. It has to be very sort of down to
Right.
earth, you know, clear, concise. This is why you need to make this investment. This is what
Hmm.
this will return to you in terms of the business. And that's the case. And the problem is that if you don't have that approach, what you have is what we had right at the beginning of the century when we were going through the great I'm going to outsource everything
Right.
phase.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
oh, we're going to outsource our network and it's going to be cheap. And
Hmm.
it's not cheap. It costs us
Yeah.
5 times as much. And we can't go back because
We
we
don't have
can't go
anything on
back.
board now. Yeah. It always, since you're
So
going back to the turn of the century, it always reminds me of the movie Office Space when he's like, I take the orders from the customers and I give them to the engineers. The engineers don't have people skills, right? That's one of the really hard things about sort of IT infrastructure, any kind of IT management, is that your bosses have no idea what you're talking about, and to be able to translate, just something as basic as budgets to what is needed from the network. And especially in this environment, increasingly, I say this a lot, but that the network is now starting to be seen as more of a business enabler than a something that's reactionary to requests from the rest of the company, right? And so that
oh,
conversation
absolutely.
is a real skill.
Yeah.
Right? So yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the thing is that, and again, you're as a manager, you're competing against everything that those managers, that those non-technical people
Hmm.
are experiencing every day in their lives. Well,
Right.
I get updates from Facebook, and it's they benefit, or sort of, you know, they live in this world. It's like, well, look at how all this all works, right?
Hmm.
Why
Hmm.
can't
Right. Why
my
this
enterprise
should work
applications?
for us? Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and and while again, it's just been amazing, right? The kind of things that enterprises have been able to accomplish with the cloud in the last decade, in terms
Hmm.
of being able to deliver those kind of really meaningful user experiences.
Right.
The thing that still comes with that is that there's so much that's happening around in the background, right? That sometimes comes about from that's just it's happened because we've over-engineered, or we've overbuilt, or
Hmm.
we've over. So it was funny. This is 5 or 6 years ago. I was at a conference, and somebody was coming upstairs. It's like, so I'm going to talk to you about cloud security. But the first thing I'd like to be clear is, can we all agree that cloud is not necessarily less expensive? And then there was like this and
Yeah.
this uproaring of laughter and whatever.
Right.
But the funny thing about it is that at the time, right, the conversation that he was trying to basically frame was, yes, it's more expensive right now, right? It
Hmm.
is more expensive, but it won't necessarily be more expensive in the
Right.
long term, right?
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
because really, you know, that's the thing about this, about the journey is that we're giving you the tools to basically be able to sort of move into the water, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you might be complaining that I don't have the manager of managers, right? But you do have the ability to at least be able to enable and deliver, right, in a way that was better than what you had before when you had nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But now the path is there for you to basically, figure out how to make it more cost effective, how to make it more flexible, and to deliver the outcomes you want. And that's where the shift is having to rethink, right? I deploy this, I do this, and then I'm done, and we're done. It's
Right.
You're having to basically make this shift as a professional
Mm-hmm.
to be, right, somebody who's helping the business guide, uh, you know, uh, down the path to really realize its technology potential.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be able to do that. So that communications piece, as you're saying, is so critical, because if you can't do that as this manager, right, it 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 creates a very difficult path for you. And then at the same time, you're trying to get your engineers to sort of rethink how they do things, because
Mm-hmm.
now they have to be more aware of, you know, of what the business value is. And they're like, but I'm a technologist. I
Right.
just solve things. Like, it's
Right.
everything is black and white. It's binary to me. And it may be, but it's not that hard to basically say, well, this binary black and white thing makes it possible for you to support the business, right? To
Mm-hmm.
deliver improved customer experience, right? To enable expansive growth.
Right.
It's We forget that that a lot of companies um, that are really seen as real early technology pioneers, right? They had to build all of this themselves, right? The
Mm-hmm.
funny thing is, for those kind of companies, right, they're in the process of now saying, "Wow, we built all this stuff, but it's 20 years old. You know what? Now, because we pioneered that, well, now there's an entire marketplace and an entire ecosystem that basically provides the same thing, and then they do it better, faster, and cheaper.
Right.
But now we have to figure out how to transition,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
So
Exactly. Yeah.
where everyone is going through this in this
Mm-hmm.
experience, right? And it's just simply understanding that you have to be able to go back and embrace, right, much more fundamentally, right, how you see things, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about an automated task. It's not just about orchestration. It's not just about, why do I need to buy this platform or this platform. It's more about an approach where you have to think more structurally, and sort of realize that you know there's a sort of a there's sort of a virtue in being OCD, right? Or
Yeah. You're
being,
right. And
a little
that
retentive, because
right.
that's what really makes it possible for you
Right.
to deliver that kind of automation at scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I'm also picking up from all of this too that there's an element of kind of you will never arrive. There's kind of the idea of like, okay, there's here's the place that I want to be. We acquired the skills, we deployed everything, it's all running, we're done. But in a way that might never materialize, because the ground is always shifting underneath you, and there's always new demands from the business side, from things like shadow IT popping up and all of that. That there's never necessarily an endpoint where the transformation is complete. Like your example of the folks who had to design these tools 20 years ago, and then all of a sudden now, because of economies of scale, the tools that they designed are out there cheaper and better and more efficient. And so then you have to transform again, right? That you'll essentially be transforming forever. Perhaps that's the job, right?
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
that is sort of the job, and frankly, you sort of want that to be happening, right? Because
Hmm.
again, that's where, right, the economies of scale come in. That's where you start to get the cost reduction. That's how you get the agility, and that ability to really deliver the value. And I think that's what, you know I mean, after 30 years of this, that's the one thing I keep coming back to. It's like, when we were, at the beginning, it was just about how do I even get this to work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then it refines and refines and refines, and now it's so ubiquitous that nobody even realizes, everything that is happening. And the fact is that a lot of that elegance came from that these people who built a lot of these foundational things embraced these simple sort of ideas of like, you know, we want things to be simple. We want them to be extendable. We want them to be modular, right?
Mm-hmm.
APIs, right? Which, were not necessarily something that were embraced well at the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have
Mm-hmm.
become the
Mm-hmm.
cornerstone of how everything has worked. But they are
Right.
completely born out of that idea of this simple, extendable, modular, simple approach, right?
Right.
I want to take a collection of tools, right? And this is why we all need to basically every year thank Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie, who created Unix and created this sort
Mm-hmm.
of mindset
Mm-hmm.
of taking these, right, simple component pieces and basically building them in to pipelines or into task-oriented delivery.
Right.
Because if it hadn't been for that elegance, right, at the beginning, where we are today would never even be possible.
Right.
So,
Right.
I tell this to all, network engineers. If you have to go back and sort of you at least should understand how Unix came about and
Mm-hmm.
the design principles around it and at least how it works fundamentally, because everything is just this, has come from this, right? This very simple approach. So it's not so much this challenge that you can't basically meet. it's
Mm-hmm.
it's already there. It's been broken down for you. You just have to be able to sort of embrace the fact that it's there. We're not asking people to come up with, and by the way, it's not like we invented automation, you know, 15 years ago.
Right.
It
Right.
was,
Right.
it's 100 plus years old. So the fact
Right.
is that, we just have to sort of I like to say, take a historical approach to this, because those skills that you need are probably there. You just have to basically pull yourself back from being focused on the problem and looking at it large as, well, how would I accomplish or deliver that problem differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
do I need to buy, do I need to buy this massive set of tools, right? Because even if I buy the massive set of tools, I still need to have sources of truth. Even if we move everything to the cloud, right,
Mm-hmm.
we still have to basically be able to use the cloud, right, to
Mm.
be able to deliver, right, a customer experience, right,
Right.
that we had, right. In other words, and that's
Right.
part of again, that's this shift, right, that that of course, you know that Google and Facebook and Amazon, as in their commercial, consumer entities, these folks have been basically, managing and dealing with, right, for
Right.
the last 2 decades.
Mm-hmm.
So they've been able, so you're trying to get, I mean, Netflix again, there's tons of digital native examples out there, right?
Right.
And the question is that, you having to sort of, again, set parameters, like, what is my business's requirement? What are those experiences, right? That I want to basically
Mm-hmm.
deliver and enable, right? And how do I do that? And that just starts, right, with this very systematic approach of breaking down each one of those delivery problems, right? From tasks to, you know, to orchestration, right, or to provisioning to delivery, right? And
Right.
as a network engineer, your job is to sort of is to work with those teams, or to be able to build consumable solutions,
Mm-hmm.
so that so that you can enable this kind of software enabled, value delivery.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we were talking before the show about that in this environment, almost everyone is multi-cloud. Across usually, several, maybe half a dozen, even kind of different cloud providers, depending on how one defines that, and that these tasks are going to be different, at least in some kind of approach or nomenclature for all of those providers, right? So you're managing all of those while you're trying to manage this transformation. You're managing it across different platforms that have different sort of concepts and protocols around all of this, right? So.
Exactly. And it's and these are problems that are universal, right?
Hmm.
These are not challenges that are specific to any one business, or it's just a question of scale, right? If
Right.
you're a pizza parlor, right, and you want to have online ordering, well, I can probably buy a service that'll facilitate that for me, right?
Hmm.
I may not need to do much, but I still need to basically make an investment. I still need
Right.
to make sure that the data sets that basically are being presented to my customers are accurate. If I'm going to be communicating with them through social media and all that, I have to build a managed approach to dealing with that. The same applies to a company that's doing automated, manufacturing, right? I
Hmm.
still have all the same challenges. I still have all the same problems. The scale is different, right? The skill sets might be different, but the tools that you need to basically be able to embrace delivering things like that as a network engineer don't change.
Hmm.
You still
Hmm.
have to be systematic. You still have to look at it, at the level of a task, and then at the level of a collection of tasks, and then that tasks become orchestration
Right.
pipelines, or become, uh, reaction or event-driven sort of delivery tasks, right? It's a shift, but the fundamentals are still the same.
Hmm.
Um, and it shouldn't be something that, I think that's what happens with a lot of people is, well, I'm not a software programmer. I'm not necessarily a software programmer either,
Right.
but but really it's there are people who write software, and then there are people who use software. Network automation is more about using software rather than
Right.
writing software. And
Right.
that's a distinction that, you know, you need to basically embrace,
Right. But
despite
that there
some of these
needs to
things.
be intelligent use of the software with
Yeah.
some
Yeah. That's
knowledge of
what
how it works, even if you don't have to actually write it. Right.
Yeah,
So yeah.
exactly. And I've seen a lot of successful approaches where people are like, where they basically, and this is quite common, is you basically pair, right, the expert with a software programmer or a software
Hmm.
team, right, and they basically do this cross translation, right. So it's
Right.
not necessarily right. There are lots of ways to approach this, um,
Hmm.
but be mindful that no matter what platform you buy or what product you buy, or whatever you start to build yourself, if you don't have that clean data, if you don't have these workflows designed, and you haven't done that business process engineering, you're just basically, you have to make the investments there first. You
Right.
have to make those
Right.
fundamental investments.
Right.
Um,
Otherwise, you'll
and
end up looping back to try to correct all of that once it doesn't work. Right. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's typically what you do see, is that what you will see that most, network engineers are feel relatively comfortable automating tasks, right?
Hmm.
And are able to get there. It's that next step, right? That is the bigger challenge.
Hmm.
Because when you're just automating a task, right, you largely have control, or more than often it's targeted, right? So
Hmm.
you're basically trying to do something that's repeatable, and there's an expectation, right? But when you try to do that at scale and it's event driven, you now have to basically add all of this additional, error checking, right?
Right.
State validation. Listen, do I want really want to make that commitment change in the middle of the production day or not? And the fact is that that requires a different, type of thinking, because now you have to start to really think about. And I think the way I sort of frame it is this way: if I know what level of capacity my network, say, has to run at, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And I've built in failure tolerance, right? I mean, most people
Right.
have. It's like, I just put in one circuit and it works. Yeah, that works for your house, right?
Right.
Until the
Until it
cable
doesn't.
breaks and
Yeah.
your kids are
Exactly.
screaming at you that they
Yeah.
can't play Xbox, and they can't watch
Hmm.
Netflix. So, you know, enterprises think beyond that. So they
Yeah.
have, but that building in of redundancy, right? That building in those layers of recovery, right? That's also, you can use that to an advantage to create a better operational experience. Because if you start to look at it as, well, I can accept failure, right? Or I
Hmm.
can accept that not everything is operating, right?
Hmm.
Now I can introduce, right? event-driven automation. I can introduce, right, event-driven change, because you have this way of scaling and assessing. Like, okay, well, I can take, I can
Mm-hmm.
have 3 network nodes go down, but I can't have more than that, right? And by the way, this is the same exact approach that if you look at any of the platforms that people buy that do automate, they use the same approach. Well,
Right.
I'll upgrade node A, and then I'll transition to node B, and so on. So, but then really sitting down and mapping that out, right? And then figuring out the downstream impact and the upstream impact, right? That's part of the responsibility as a network manager or a network engineer, to explain what the impact is going to be when I make those changes. Because
Mm-hmm.
really what you're trying to also get with network automation is I don't want to say zero downtime, right? But you're trying to basically get into an environment where you have non-disruptive, right, introduction and management of your services, right?
Right.
So, and that for most businesses is the biggest push, right? Is That's why you're making that investment. Because where I might have to deal with, quarterly maintenances, or I have services that you can't go down, or I mean, every network engineer has a story about, oh, I was on a device and it turned out it's been up for 12 years,
Right. Right. Yeah.
you know, and you're like, well, why is that? And you're like, well, I'm not really sure, but you know, and and the fact is that you know it's those kind of operational things that basically come into play all the time, especially with tiny staffs, or staffs that are basically trying to basically deliver value, right,
Right.
and juggle, right, historical, or what we call legacy management, right? So that's where, right, again, the investment is still the same. You
Right.
have to have that visibility. You have to establish those sources of truth, and you have to build those processes, regardless of the tooling. That's where the big investments are, and those are things that that a that an enterprise team can start to embrace early on, and are not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily disruptive or time uh, intensive, in the sense that I have to basically disrupt what I'm currently doing to try and basically support the business, right? You
Right.
can
Right.
factor that in your resource planning to basically really take that, and if you make a steady commitment to that, right, you'll even find that it just, even if you're not automated, it just has a large return in just increasing stability and improving the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it strikes me that some of the implications of this might be for some of your non-technical management consultant colleagues at McKinsey, right, to convince the other powers that be within the enterprise to facilitate the kind of resources that the IT infrastructure team needs to make these changes happen, right? So you can have a lot more influence, than maybe some of my podcast guests, and in changing the enterprise world if you can get to some of your management consultant colleagues there, right? So yeah.
Yeah, well, it's sort of funny. That's one of the things that actually, it's those kind of changes that I think that the firm has really been dedicated to
Hmm.
basically bringing to its customers. I'm sorry, it's our clients. Is
Hmm.
is the fact that, right, you that embracing a digital journey requires that you have to be acutely aware of the investments on both sides. That you have to really
Hmm.
understand, right, that you're making a commitment to resources, um, that's going to basically pay back, right? Um, in some cases exponentially, right? It's not necessarily. I think again, if I when I think back, 5, 6, 7 years ago, when, oh, we're going to automate everything, we're going to go to software defined, it's going to be, and people were literally going, well, what am I going to do? My, the reality is that it's very clear, you know, in the technology field, we do not have enough people.
Right.
Right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
really, it's not a question that that anyone can sit there and say, well, I don't know what's going to happen with my career path. That's not the case. There is
Hmm.
there you the wonderful thing about being in technology is being able to embrace new things, to learn new things, to basically sort of reinvent yourself, right? And
Hmm.
I think that's the key, right? Is to understand that, you know, these are really wonderful new challenges to embrace new technologies. And the thing is that if you are willing to take one step further, you begin to realize they're not as new as you think they are.
Right.
It's just this evolution, right? Again, of this forward thinking and this sort of insightful approach of the early development people that really made those choices, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
largely they got that experience from technology that didn't have anything to do with computers. They had to do with manufacturing. That had to
Right.
do with development, assembly lines, all these things. So
Mm-hmm.
it's very interesting as you look at it as a circle because you know as we evolve, right, we tend to as humans, of course, replicate models, but we do learn right
Mm-hmm.
from each time we replicate those models to make them better and to make them more efficient. And so it's not something that you should be looking at as not as something you can't do. It's more along the lines of you have to basically shift your thinking and then sort of embrace this not as a technical problem, but just as a problem.
Right. Exactly. It's a process problem. Yeah. Exactly. All technical all technical stuff is just a process, right? So it's you just have to know the
Exactly.
process, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that's the thing I've been telling teams for years. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's not a technical problem. This is a problem. You just need to figure out how to take it apart and then apply a technology solution to it,
Right.
right? It might be a business problem. You need to apply a technology solution to it. And network automation and orchestration is just a one component of that, but it's a new skill set and a new tool set that that networkers have to basically embrace so that they can basically essentially free themselves up to deal with the bigger problems that you're having to deal with or you're being asked
Mm-hmm.
to deal with, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think that's where it gets lost.
Yeah.
Because God knows there's been I keep saying this. I said the tooling is amazing. I mean, just amazing. But that tooling came about because there was a demand, and that's the
Right.
thing that is people miss. It's not like these tools have always been there. They
Mm-hmm.
came about because because there was people started looking at this as there's a better way to solve this problem.
Right. Right.
We want to make those investments, right? And you as a technologist need to sort of take the cue from that and saying, hey, there's a better way to solve this problem, and these tools and this methodology and this approach is the approach I need to take, rather than just sort of sticking with what I know and now sort of embracing right a new way of thinking about it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's a lot to chew on. This may be one that some folks want to go back and re-listen to. Michael, is there any way people can follow you or get in touch with you if they were so inclined?
You can reach me at Martin at outlan.net.
All right.
Um, that's the best way to get a hold of me, at least.
Yeah.
Um, and of course I'm sure I'll see people at the next WAN summit when we actually have
Yeah.
people together at some point, hopefully.
Yeah. There is
And
one tentatively scheduled for June of this year, so we'll
yeah,
see.
so hopefully
Yeah.
we'll all get together there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, yeah, it was a real pleasure having you. It was a dense topic, so I appreciate you sort of taking me through it. That was excellent.
All right, well, enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, yeah. And before I go, I got to ask you. You're in your workshop. I see like the Dead Kennedy sticker. So I'm a big sort of like hardcore metal punk kind of guy. What's your jam?
Well, actually, what's funny is I didn't start off as I was a very anti technology person. I
Hmm.
grew up with family that had worked at Bell and
Yeah.
engineers, and I was very early on. I was like very against it. Like
Well, I see in
I,
your
I
in
already
your
know
LinkedIn
that stuff.
background, you're like a philosophy major, right? So
Yeah.
yeah,
So right. So I was a
yeah,
philosophy major.
yeah.
So for a number of years, right, I also was a roadie, and I did
Nice.
and
Yeah.
I also repair vacuum tube amplifiers and other sort of vintage equipment. So it sort of came about from there. So yeah, so I'm a way back in the day I had very different hair and
Yeah.
and frankly I keep getting yelled at by my kids. They're like, there's music that's been created in the 21st century that you should consider listening to. And I go,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure there is.
That's awesome.
So
well,
there you
we'll
go.
have to exchange notes sometime
Yes,
over
we
a beer
definitely
at a
will.
conference there. So yeah. Awesome. All right. Thanks. Cheers. Thanks for listening. The WAN Manager podcast comes from the team at TeleGeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. I also wrote the theme song that you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com. Or if you want to get right into more WAN content like you hear on the show, you can visit TeleGeography's WAN forum at wanforum.com. We've got all of our podcast episodes over there, WAN Manager survey data, and extra analysis pages. That's all for now. So until next time, WAN enthusiasts,